today we have with us, our guest is Lucinda Dirven. She is Professor of Antique Religion in Nijmegen, or if I pronounce it correctly, or you can also correct me. She graduated in art history and theology from the University of Leiden, where she did and obtained a PhD with a thesis on the Palmyrene of Dura Europos, the study of religious interaction in Roman Syria. Her research focuses on religion history in the Middle East, with a particular attention for the city of Atra and Palmyra in the Roman times. Lately, Professor Dirven has been working on a catalogue of the sculpture from Atra, and in particular on the relationship between Atra and Hierapolis. And not only, in addition, she's studying the interaction between various religious groups in Syria and Egypt, with focus on the 3rd and 4th century. So, welcome, Professor Dirven.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's our pleasure. And today we will talk with you about, or better, you will explain us something more about the Palmyrene Diaspora. And specifically, we would like to know something more about the relationship between the city of Palmyra and the one of Atra. So let's start directly with my first question. Why are Palmyrenes so apt for a study on the development of a diaspora community?
Yes, I think that that is the case because the material that we have on this particular diaspora community, if you want to call it that way, I would prefer to call it expatriates or something, because for me diaspora has too many other connotations, like, you know, forced, yeah, things like that. So anyway, but it doesn't matter. But the material that we do have is quite exceptional, and when you come to think of it, especially if you, if you would like to study the religious interaction of a diaspora community today, what are the things that you would like to know? What would you need to know to say something about their choices and their behavior? And that is actually quite a lot, because you need to know something about the situation in their home, where they're coming from, and then you want to know why they left there, and you want to know how they are being received in the new situation. You want to know not only what they did there, but you also want to know what the people around them did there, and you want to know that for a certain amount of time. And these two elements also have to match, because you want to know it for the same period of time. So, you know, you cannot have like 100 or 200 years of difference, because then the situation would, of course, be completely different. We all know that, you know, if you look at today. So I think for Palmyra, we and the community in Dura, we have this exceptional situation, because we are quite well informed about the cultural, political and religious situation in Palmyra itself for the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. And then we have the material from Dura Europos, where the Palmyrenes have been attested from, say, just before the beginning of the Common Era till the fall of the city in 265 AD, and for a continuous period. So that is quite something, and we could sort of reasonably say something about the reason why they went there, and how long they stayed, and what was their function. And last but not least, we know, of course, a lot about Dura Europos itself. We know the context. We have this wonderful 3rd century city, that we have at least like 15 different sanctuaries, and we know quite a bit about all these different religious groups, and of course we know quite a bit about its social, economic and political situation. So we can really study the Palmyrenes there in context, and compare them with the situation back home. And I think it is, for this, it is one of the few examples from antiquity that we can in fact do this.
Yeah, indeed, I think that Dura Europos is the best example for to analyze a little bit this community of the Palmyrene diaspora. Yeah, of course, diaspora, as you said at the beginning, it's a term a little bit debated and really complicated, but let's say that Dura gives us the opportunity to explain why the Palmyrene were there. But to start a little bit from the beginning and try to understand better why the Palmyrene arrived there, maybe we have to ask to ourselves, what was Dura Europos like before the arrival of the Palmyrenes?
Yeah, that's a good question, but a very difficult one to answer, because in fact, the oldest inscription that has been found in Dura Europos so far is a Palmyrene inscription. And so that is, it's dated to 33 BC, and it was found in a temple that was founded by them outside the city walls. It's called, for convenience sake, the Necropolis Temple, because the Necropolis city is around it, but it's got nothing to do with that. And actually, before, and it's from that period onwards that our sources for Dura began. So all we know about Dura is basically about the period of the Common Era, and it was founded, of course, in the Hellenistic period. But from these first, say, 2.5 centuries, we know very, very little. What we know is that it was a foundation by probably by ex-Seleucid soldiers, and they probably got granted by the king certain pieces of land on the Middle Euphrates, so-called kleroi, to establish themselves. And that is quite telling, I think, in itself, because it shows that the Middle Euphrates, and of which Dura Europos was like sort of a center, was a very fertile region. And so you could say that probably from the very beginning, this was the reason why people settled there. And this was the way that the city more or less functioned as a regional center of this very fertile area. And not so much as a military foundation, which is something that has been said frequently in the past. It no doubt also had a military function, but we have to realize that at that specific moment in time, it was not yet located on the border. Because, of course, the Seleucid Empire was much bigger. So it was basically controlling maybe traffic along the Euphrates, of course, a very important way of traffic, but not so much a frontier town that it became later on. So, So, and what we could sort of say is that that this function, this sort of regional function, is probably something that sort of stayed on also in the beginning of the Common Era.
So Atra probably was there already before the arrival of the Palmyrene. We don't know anything about that, unfortunately. But we know the Palmyrene was there, and we would like to understand a little bit better why did they choose to go to Dura, and why became the city so important for them. I mean, we have kind of a big presence in Atra, in Dura of the Palmyrene. Why?
Yes, well, that's a question that is only to be answered with circumstantial evidence, unfortunately, because we have no definitive proof of it. So it's all based on common sense and circumstantial evidence. But my idea would be that at least the majority of the Palmyrenes at the beginning, so in the period that the city was still dominated by the Parthians, so before the Roman period, so the Romans came in 165, and from that time onwards, the dynamic in the city really changes. But not, so we are now talking about the period before that. And in this period, we know that the city really functioned as this regional center of this very fertile area. And my guess would be that the Palmyrenes, who came from a city that was, of course, exactly in this period, becoming very important and was really growing exponentially because of the caravan trade that became important in this period. And of course, as we all know, Palmyra is located in the desert. It's an oasis. And although we now know that there's some agricultural activity being that was possible in the neighborhood, it was definitely not enough to keep this huge city going. So my guess would be that they went to Dura Europos to trade and to buy local produce from this Euphrates region, like wine and grain and fruits and things, and this was basically the reason. But in all honesty, we do not have any inscription saying so, from which it may be inferred that they were indeed merchants and involved in trade. And also very important, we do not have any information from Palmyra itself on this. All we know about the Palmyrenes in Dura comes from Dura, and there's nothing from Palmyra to show for it. I mean, if we hadn't found Dura, we wouldn't know about it, basically, which is, I think, important in itself. And it says also something about the kind of relationship, and that this was very much on a local level. And formerly, it was long thought that Dura was perhaps located on the route of the Palmyrene caravans. And that this was actually the reason that they went there, and that it was also trade, but then trade on a more, a ground level, say. And in my book, I sort of tried to find a middle way, saying that they were also there for local trade. And since then, there has been new research by Norwegian scholars, and they have now, I think, shown with definite proof that the caravan route was another one, and that Dura Europos was never on that route. So we basically have to stick with the idea that they went there for the local trade. And what we have to show for it, as I said, is circumstantial evidence. So we have this temple that was founded outside the city walls, with a huge area around it that may have been used, for example, for the animals to stay there. I mean, it is quite a funny location.
Yeah, I would say too. Yeah.
And so this would be like a reasonable explanation that it was because of the trade, and you would not take all your animals and stuff, like really inside. Of course, the city, of course. So this is one thing, and another thing is another temple, the so-called Temple of the Gade, the protective deities of Dura and Tadmor, Palmyra, that was found very near the bazaar, so the marketplace. And one of the famous finds from this sanctuary is 2 reliefs that show us the god of Dura and the protective deity of Palmyra. And these 2 show that we are in fact dealing with a community that was, for its well-being, dependent on both cities. And I think it is a logical conclusion that it is particularly merchants that are dependent on both cities, because of course in the city that you are living and trading, you have to have a very good relationship with your neighbors, and you need a very good relationship with the city where you're coming from, because you're dealing between the two. So so this is basically the evidence we have. But yeah.
As you said, we have to think about them as expats. So what an expat do is, of course, create a new life in the center in which he or she is living, but of course maintains also a good relationship with the motherland, like that, with the mother city.
Definitely, I think they did. Yes, yes.
And as you explained, Dura was probably really important for its agriculture, and you explained a little bit already about probably the presence of merchants. So what comes next for me to ask you is, which kind of Palmyrenes can we find there and why? I mean, only merchants or also others?
No, also others. Indeed, as I already said, in 165, situation really changes quite dramatically. Because from that moment onwards, Dura becomes part of the Roman Empire. And so then it is located on the most eastern border of the Roman Empire. And from that time onwards, we also find Roman soldiers and auxiliary groups stationed in the city. And there's debate, and especially recently, that debate is getting more intense about the meaning of the military presence, say at the end of the 2nd century. It was formerly said that it was especially from the beginning of the 3rd century that Dura really became like a fort, like a military fort, and that before that time there were only just very few military and probably also not yet officially Roman groups. But by recent research by Simon James, who is the expert on the military in Dura Europos, he has shown us that it is very likely that this military presence was quite strong already before that. And in fact, the first to be military to be found there are Palmyrenes, at the beginning as the so-called Palmyrene archers. That is how they call themselves, and they are clearly at that time, and that time is 169 and 170, because at that time they are dedicating 2 reliefs in a Mithraeum. And so a sanctuary dedicated to the god Mithra, that was in fact dedicated by Palmyrene soldiers, and there they are still being called themselves archers, showing that they are not yet officially connected to the Roman army, but very soon afterwards we know that they got organized in the so-called 20th Palmyrene cohort, which is a very important cohort that we know mainly because of the many papyri that have been found in Dura. And that was a huge unit that consisted mainly of military from Palmyra, but also probably not exclusively. So, bottom line, we have 2 main groups. We have, say, the merchants or the people involved into the local economy before the Roman period, and then afterwards it is mainly soldiers. But of course we cannot exclude that there were still also people from Palmyra living there that were still being involved in the trade. It's not like a clear cut. Definitely not. We also know, because I was already saying that we know that they live there. And the most important evidence to this respect is domestic. In one of the houses was found an andron, the room that people were using for dining. And inside we find paintings and inscriptions, and these are clearly by Palmyrenes. And it doesn't seem very likely that these were soldiers. That must have been a house.
Yeah, probably not.
Probably of somebody involved in other activities. So, so the two sort of coexist. But you can say, though, that especially in the 3rd century, these military become an ever bigger presence in the city, and they are sort of, you know, taking all the resources also. You know, you have to imagine this huge community of soldiers that really are influencing life in this rather small city.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
And of course, eating all the stuff and things and drinking everything. So there's
changing the shape really of the city, I would say, somehow.
Yeah.
Also.
So yeah, that this is basically the two groups that we can distinguish. Yeah.
And you said that anyway they were able to maintain a connection with the motherland, with the homeland. Sorry. How and why? Can we see this clearly?
Yes, of course, part of this is based on common sense. But you can see it very clearly because they are importing, for example, sculptures from Palmyrene. And also the subject of these sculptures is clearly based on knowledge of the local situation in Dura Europos. So that can only be ordered by someone knowledgeable of the place. And this is again these reliefs from the Gada. Another important indication for this is the fact that they were having their own priests. So they're still really Palmyrene priests that are characterized by a certain headdress and certain clothing and thing, and sticking to this. And one very intriguing example of this is from this temple in the necropolis, because we have the foundation inscription that I refer to from 33 BC, and then we have another inscription that is, this is by heart, I think 74 or so, which is in Greek, no longer in Palmyrene, in Greek, but it is still dedicated to the same deity, Baal, who was an important Palmyrene god, by a descendant of the founder. So apparently there is like a continuity also in families that are being involved with this connection between the cities. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and they maintained also the cults, and they maintained the connection with the Palmyrene religion. This is really interesting. Also, generations after.
Yes. Well, of course, you would like to know more. You would like to know, if they died, were they being buried in Dura? Were they being maybe brought home? I mean, it is after all only like 220 kilometers. You could still in theory do this, but we have no idea, and that is really a shame, because also the traditions. The tradition of burial in Dura Europos and Palmyra was very different. And we have in Palmyra, we have these beautiful towers, or we have this hypogea that families got buried, and with these beautiful portraits. And we don't have this in Dura. We don't have any portraits, which is quite remarkable if you speak in like sort of, cultural differences. So in this respect, Palmyra was more like a Roman city, and Dura was more like an eastern city. And but you could imagine that as a Palmyrene, you would like to be buried in your home town with your family, since we know that these family connections were very important and all this. But no, unfortunately, nothing. And we don't know nothing about this. And another interesting thing is that for the military, for this 20th Palmyrene cohort, The military experts say that it seems to be very likely that people just had one post, so that they stayed in Dura for like 20 or 25 years. That's
a really long time.
A long time. And it could be that they were stationed then, you know, in one of the villages along the Euphrates, and but they were not, you know, going from one place in the Roman Empire to another or something. It was really like a local thing.
Yeah, so one can imagine that they wanted also to hold onto their religious and cultural beliefs, let's say like that. And at this point, we saw that there were merchants, we saw that there were soldiers. Can you distinguish between the religious and cultural behavior of Palmyrene of one side, so merchants, and the other one of soldiers?
Yes, well, I have argued in my thesis that you can. That was basically one of the main points in my thesis, and the reason behind this is that the idea that your religious behavior and preferences is very much determined by your social position and situation.
Yeah, sure.
And the theory was, and still is, basically, that if you look at the merchants, you are looking at a group. Maybe they were not all merchant, but at least they were involved in quite intensive contact with the city they were coming from, and they were dependent from both cities, because as traders they are sort of in between. And so I've argued that to explain their religious choices, we should take this into account and look at what people do in Palmyra itself, how religion is organized there, and how that relates to what we see that people outside do. And if you look at the religious organization in Palmyra, you can sort of compare it to like a pyramid. You have the social organization and the religious organization, and both this. And at the bottom, you have like the families. And then on top, you have larger organizations. You could call it tribes or clans or whatever, but they are sort of family-based, or at least they are presumably, they pretend to be family-based. Very complicated discussion. And then on top, we have the city. And these are different sort of levels of identity that are also related to different levels of religiosity. So at the bottom, we have the family deities, and then we have sort of the tribal or the clan deities that we can sort of see in Palmyra represented in the most important sanctuaries in the city. You have these so-called 4 tribes, and these, well, it's a very complicated discussion. I can't go into that now, but I think what is important is that you can see that these sanctuaries are at least related to certain tribes and neighborhoods. And on top of that, we have the civic sanctuary, the Temple of Baal, and that is very much the temple of all the Palmyrenes. That is also how it is said in the inscriptions. And this is clearly their communal identity. And so my argument is that once people go outside and are a small group that consists of people with different backgrounds, for example, tribes, families, that they choose for a common religious ground, also to become one community abroad. So this would mean that they would either choose Baal, who was the most important deity, or one of the other gods that are important for the city as a whole. And we can see this, for example, very clearly in this temple in the necropolis, this oldest inscription from 33 BC, that is being dedicated by two people who belong to different tribes. And one of them is a member of the Bene Komare. And the Bene Komare is a very famous, well-known tribe. And they had their own sanctuary, and that was dedicated to the gods Aglibol and Malachbel. Yeah. But in Dura, he is choosing not for Aglibol or Malachbel, but he's choosing for Bel, the city god, and Yargibol, who is also the most important. He's he's the god of the FK and is very important for the community. So, so this is, I think, a very telling example. First of all, we don't have one inscription from Palmyra where we see members of two different tribes acting together. So this is something that is typical for abroad, that they do act together. And then if they act together, they are choosing for a common ground and for the city god. So, so this is basically in a nutshell, the theory. And we see it also, for example, in this temple of the Gade, where we see this relief of the protective deity of Dura, of the city, and the protective deity of Palmyra, the city. I think that looking back, at my study that is now more than 20 years old, I tried too hard to sort of press this into a mold. I wanted it to fit very neatly. And of course, religion doesn't work like that. Especially with religion, people can also do their own things, and there are always exceptions and stuff. And I think that this was definitely also the case here. So there are definitely exceptions, I think, to this rule. But overall, I do still firmly believe that it works in overall like this, so that people choose for something and that they won't go for their personal, at least not in public. So this is for the traders. They do this. So they very much stick to the religion of their hometown, but in the choices that they make, these choices are determined by the situation outside. So there is a change. And then if we look at the military, so the Palmyrenes who were serving in the Roman army, we see another situation. On the one hand, they are very much taking part in what we would call military religion. So both officially, the official religion of the Roman army, and unofficially, like for example this cult of the god Mithra that was popular among soldiers, or Jupiter Doligenus and gods like that. And we can show that they are also taking part in this. And at the same time, they also hold on to their own deities, which we can see very clearly in a very famous fresco, the so-called sacrifice of the tribune Julius Terentius. That was in fact one of the first paintings that was ever found in Dura Europos. And it shows the tribune, also the head of the Palmyrene cohort, sacrificing before three statues. And there's been discussion about what they are, emperors or Palmyrene deities, but I think you can show that they are deities. So they still do their own thing, but their preference is changing, because now they show a clear preference for solar deities.
Yeah.
So it is Yargibel and Malachbel, two Palmyrene gods that become very popular among the military, and both of them in their capacity as a sun god. And this is due to, say, the fashion in the army at the time. Also, other groups are having this same preference for solar deities. So there's definitely two different ways of behavior.
And this is really a spontaneous question. Would you say that the religion of the merchants was more a private religion, which they were trying to make the religion of a group, since they had to kind of identify themselves, while the one of the soldiers was more a religion which had a connection with the imperial beliefs?
Yes, I think so. I think that that the first group it seems to be, as far as the evidence go, because of course this is
of course we have always to take that into account.
No problem, but as far as the evidence goes, it seems to me to be much more inward looking, and they were more like a specific group. I think there was quite some interaction by members of this group with the people around them. But they were probably then adapting themselves to the others. So they were, if they were writing, they were probably doing that in Greek and stuff. So we tend to lose them then, that's really a problem. But at the same time, we see them very much also as this community that wants to stick together. And that's definitely different in a military environment, where they really also want to be part of the whole. And also because we speak of this 20th Palmyrene cohort like it is only people from Palmyra that are taking part in that. But we know for sure, really, that this was not the case. And that there was also probably local people from Dura or people from other cities in Syria that were part of that cohort. And yet all of them were paying homage to Palmyrene deities. So that's already another situation. So
exactly, that's really interesting, and it's interesting to see how the Palmyrene opened always to their culture, their religion, to the others, not only in Palmyra but also abroad. And then I would like to ask you, did the Palmyrene presence then have an impact on the inhabitants of Dura Europos, or vice versa?
Did they have a huge influence? Well, you would expect them to have a huge influence, both culturally, economically, religiously. Especially, I think, in the early period, you would think so, with this trading connection, and you could. But unfortunately, there's very, very little to show for it, and it's quite amazing. I mean, religiously, you could sort of still think, okay, they stay more or less together, so that's logically. But you would also expect that there was maybe, you could sort of see Palmyra like this big sister that is could really influence this rather smaller but nearby town, also culturally, of course, Palmyra developed into this magnificent Greco-Roman city with this very specific mix also of Semitic influences, and we see very little of that. Really, disappointingly little influence. Yeah. It's, I mean, this if you imagine coming from Palmyra with the beautiful streets and so on, with the columns and the statues, the honorary statues on all the public places, and then going to Dura, that must have felt like really, really different. I mean, there was no column street there, and there was no public statues and stuff. It would really have been another world, and so we see, for example, that the Palmyrenes, their temples, they look like all the other temples from Dura. They're not doing their own thing. So in that sense, they are adapting. In the early period, there seems to be some cultural influence also in the local sculpture in Dura Europos. You can see them non-Palmyrene sculptures. There's just a small group of quite high quality local production that is stylistically definitely influenced by Palmyra. So there was, I think, some influence. But that stops largely in the Roman period. Then we see local production going down, and it becomes all quite, well, not very advanced. And then you see actually Palmyrenes doing two things. Either they go back to Palmyra to get their own. I think if they wanted to some real quality, they just didn't want to buy it in Dura anymore. So they are importing them. And other ones are using the local sculptures and asking them to make, say, typical Palmyrene subjects in a local style. So this is what we see culturally in influence, but that's not much. But I have to say that there is, I think, a caveat here, that most of the material, of course, from Dura that we have dates from the last 50 years. And this was the period that the presence of the military became stronger. So it's very difficult to say how it was like in the 1st century. But still. And then religiously speaking, it is also very little, because as far as we can see, the sanctuaries that are being, we can identify as being Palmyrene, because there was Palmyrene script, Palmyrene deities, people with Palmyrene names, that makes it very likely that these were indeed Palmyrenes. We don't see people from outside taking part in those sanctuaries. And also we don't see them taking part in the other temples. But of course, this is also a problem of the sources. Because if they were going to the others and they were setting up an inscription in Greek, maybe using their Greek name instead of their Semitic name, we lose them. So we have only one temple from the early period that may have been like a joint temple. That is the temple of Zeus Kyrios Baal Shemin, because that is a relief that has a bilingual inscription, both Greek and Palmyrene. And so that could well be a joint, say. And then in the Roman period, you see some mix. I think that if you look at the Mithraeum that was being founded by Palmyrenes, it probably very soon became a temple that was also being used by non-Palmyrenes. And one of the reasons for thinking is that there's two inscriptions, one from 169 and the other is from only a year later, 170. And the one from 170 is also in Greek. And a dedication of a votive relief by a Palmyrene in Greek is very strange. It's not something you would find in Palmyra. You dedicate in Palmyrene. And only if you do something in public, you know, like you set up a temple or something, you use Greek. So my guess would be that they were doing this because they were in a mixed group. There was also people who didn't.
With people who didn't speak Aramaic, and
I think so.
That has a sense.
Here you see like a mix, and then we finally have this very intriguing case from the temple of the so-called temple of Baal, or the Palmyrene gods of, well, in which we have a fresco that depicts a person named Otes, and he is sacrificing for 5 Palmyrene deities. And this Otes is a Boulutes, so someone with some standing in the city. And Otes is not a Palmyrene name, so this may have been like a local person, and he is setting up this. So that is intriguing.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think that that's why Dura is a so good example so representative for the Palmyrene diaspora, because we see that there are Palmyrenes, but sometimes these Palmyrenes decided to speak in Greek without referring probably to their, without using their Aramaic language, or they decided to maybe follow a cult that in Palmyra they would not follow so much, since we know, as you said, that in Palmyra there was this tribal structure, which we don't see here in Dura. So I think that Dura really gives us an hint of how the Palmyrenes changed when they were abroad and when they had to live abroad for a long time. I mean, you also say that the soldiers lived probably, some soldiers lived there for 25 years. And if you think about it, 25 years is basically all the career of a soldier. This must have modified them, as of course it modified the inhabitants and itself the city of Dura. So a complicated example, but I think the best example to really understand all the phases of Dura and of the Palmyrene diaspora in Dura. So I can only thank you very, very much, Lucinda, to have been our guest and to have explained us. I hope to see you again and to have you again as our guest. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And to our public, I say we see each other the next time with the next Alte Geschichte im Dialog appointment. Thank you.